Welcome to the Ignatius Press Podcast. I'm Mark Brumley. Pax Invictis, unconquered peace. Not so many years ago, few would have used that expression, whether in Latin or in English, of Cardinal George Pell. Accused of sexual abuse, he was convicted and sent to prison. This despite the lack of evidence and the impossible circumstances under which the abuse supposedly happened, and despite the fact that as a high-ranking Vatican official, Cardinal Pell could have avoided the trial altogether under diplomatic immunity. Instead, he returned to his native Australia, was tried and convicted, and spent 404 days in solitary confinement for a crime he didn't commit. Justice was eventually served when the Australian Supreme Court overturned his conviction and Cardinal Pell was vindicated. On the podcast today, Tess Livingstone, author of the definitive biography, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictis, tells the story of the great church leader's time in prison, the intrigue around his work in the Vatican uncovering corruption, and his eventual legal triumph, as well as the story of his extraordinary service to the church under 5 popes. Author Tess Livingstone is a seasoned Australian journalist. She's written on politics, economics, education, issues of culture wars, and strategic policy. She is the chief lead writer for The Australian and The Weekend Australian, where she worked since 2007. This is an interview about a giant of a man who sought to reform the Catholic Church's finances at the highest levels and who met with great opposition, but who through his Catholic faith triumphed in the end. You'll want to get a copy of this extraordinary biography, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictis, perhaps the most significant biography of a church leader in our time. It's available at your local Catholic bookstore and online at ignatius.com. And now, Tess Livingstone on Cardinal George Pell.
Tell us about Cardinal Pell. If you were to summarize who he is, what would you say?
I would say he was an intensely loyal Catholic leader, loyal to the teaching of Jesus Christ and loyal to the interests of the church. He was a brave person. His episcopal motto was "Be not afraid," and he was not afraid of controversy in the public square and elsewhere. I wrote this book because Father Fessio emailed me shortly after Cardinal Pell's death in January 2023 and asked me to do it. I had written an earlier book on Cardinal Pell around 24 years ago, and as Father Fessio rightly pointed out, there had been a great deal of water under the bridge since then, and such a big life really warranted a full biography. And that's why it turned out to be more than 500 pages. I don't think I've been loose with the expressions, but there was just so much in his life to get in.
Do people have misconceptions about Cardinal Pell?
People do have misconceptions about Cardinal Pell, Mark. Some people regard him as a very authoritarian figure. In fact, he was a very firm figure in emphasizing the teachings of Jesus Christ, but he had a compassionate nature and he had what was often called a very pastoral heart.
Are there other misconceptions you would want to note about him?
Well, I think your previous point about that his how he was perceived by people, I think a prime example that tells us about Cardinal Pell was his sermon at Barangaroo on the shores of Sydney Harbour on the opening day of World Youth Day 2008, where he directed that sermon not to the 99 pilgrims who were happy, but to the one pilgrim who was frightened, worried, alone, a bit overwhelmed. He understood the need for the church to be a field hospital for people, as much as a triumphalist institution of worship.
Tell us a little bit about Cardinal Pell's upbringing.
Cardinal Pell grew up in the Victorian provincial town of Ballarat, about 60 miles outside Melbourne. It was a free and easy childhood. It was a very open, rural kind of city. He learned to mix at a young age with a lot of different people because his father was the publican there. He ran the hotel, and the young George, from about the age of 10 or 11, had to help in the bar on Saturdays mornings and after school. So he learned to mix with lots of different people. And like most Australian boys, he was far more interested in sport than he was in either his schoolwork or religion. He loved his football especially.
Tell me a little bit about his vocation. How did he discern it? What were the steps taken?
Unlike many young men who discern vocation that comes at an earlier age, Cardinal Pell really only began to consider the priesthood halfway through his final year of school, year 12. He had a lot of options in front of him. He had the prospect of a professional football contract with Richmond in Melbourne to play Australian rules, which he would have loved to do. He had a scholarship to Melbourne University, which was one of Australia's best universities, and he would have studied law there and had a very lucrative career. But as he put it, there was a little something niggling in his mind that was making him a little bit uncomfortable and unhappy. And he started to suspect that our Lord wanted him to do his work. He went to see one of his teachers at school, hoping the teacher would say, you're not suited to the priesthood at all. And the young George would have been very happy to go back to the football ground and get on with being a professional player and maybe after a year or two go into university. But the teacher said, oh no, he said, I'm surprised you've taken this long to come along. I think you're very well suited to it. George Pell's mum, who was an ardent practicing Catholic from a large Irish family, was thrilled, and his father was a bit aghast because he thought his son had lots of gifts and lots of talents, and he said, oh, he might as well have been a bloody dill. Now, in Australian slang, that means he might as well have been a bit of a dope or not too bright or very ordinary, a bit stupid, but the father was a magnanimous man. He had boxed as a young man himself against his parents' wishes. And he said, well, if that's your wish, I'll back you. And as a result, the young George thought about it and he said, I'll have a go. And as a result of having a go, he finished school probably early December 1959 at St. Patrick's, Ballarat. And he entered Corpus Christi Seminary in Melbourne on the 1st of March 1960. And it became pretty quickly apparent when he got to the seminary that he'd chosen the right vocation. He became fascinated with theology. He loved the environment and he loved the work. And from there, he went on to Rome.
And tell us a little bit about his more advanced education, because I think a lot of people don't know about that.
Yeah, he from the European summer of 1963, he sailed to the Pontifical University in Rome, Propaganda Fide, as it was called, the Pontifical Urban University, where he studied for a licentiate. And he was ordained in Rome at the altar of the chair in December 1966. And after that, his education continued at Oxford University for 4 years, where he did a doctorate in early church history, particularly the role of bishops early on and the early church fathers.
So here is a man who was actually well-grounded theologically and historically, understanding the pastoral ministry of the bishop.
He was. He had a very good grounding, academic grounding. But early on, he also showed he had a pastoral heart. That became very clear at Oxford. He did a lot of pastoral work, far more than many of his peers around the district, helping out in parishes on a Sunday. And he said the first Mass, Catholic Mass, they had had at Eton College for centuries. And he got on well with the boys at Eton. And he was very keen on pastoral work, and that stayed with him throughout his life.
So tell us about how he became a bishop.
Well, that was quite a surprise. That was in around 1984. His appointment as auxiliary bishop to Sir Frank Little in Melbourne was announced after he'd had a fairly frustrating 2 years as rector of his old seminary, and he was ordained a bishop. I think might have been around 1987, and he had his years as an auxiliary bishop were very full on. He was in charge of Caritas Australia, the Catholic Aid Project, and there was a lot to be done in Cambodia after the ravages of Pol Pot, in Vietnam, in India after a horrific earthquake. He made 3 trips to China in those years and made contact with the underground church there. And one of his roles, this was perhaps his first big venture into financial reform, quite an amount of money given by the faithful for the Project Compassion appeal in Australia was going to communist groups in the Philippines. So he had to sort that out very early on. So that was a very challenging role for 9 years.
I want to move to ask about his going to prison and his coming out of prison. So you could tell us briefly about how he got there and then how he got out.
The question of how George Pell landed in prison is one of the great mysteries to many Australians, myself included. He believed in later years there should be a proper government inquiry into how it happened, and I was inclined to agree with that viewpoint. But basically, like any citizen, who was found guilty of a serious crime, the penalty was jail, and so therefore he was jailed. The charges on which he was jailed seemed preposterous to many people, but that is what the jury found. And then when he went to jail, he appealed to the Victorian Court of Appeal, which was a bench of 3 judges, and he lost that appeal 2-1. And it wasn't until probably about 400 days after he'd gone to jail, that his case was heard by the full bench of the High Court in Canberra, which would be our equivalent of the Supreme Court in Washington. And the judges of the High Court cleared him 7-0. It was very definitive.
And of course, the story of his time in prison is told in his prison journals. Any comment about that?
They're a remarkable read, Mark. I think the prison journals, as Cardinal Muller said at his first anniversary mass, they will stand a test of time like the writings of Boethius. They're a remarkable combination of practical everyday observations, the things that people wonder about, what happens inside the jails, and they also showed the depth of his faith. He couldn't have many books in there. He could have a Bible, he could have a breviary, he had a detective novel, he had a biography of Winston Churchill, but he remembered a lot of things from his seminary studies over the years, from his academic work, and he wove them into the journals, and he made it very clear in those journals that he accepted the will of God in this instance, even though he didn't understand it. He was very anxious to clear his name. Do remember, he could have stayed in Rome and claimed diplomatic immunity, but he chose not to do that. He chose to come back to Australia and clear his name. But he made it very clear in his writings, quoting St. Francis de Sales, that he forgave all his enemies and he hoped one day to face God with no grudges in his heart, and he did manage to pray for those who persecuted him.
So after he's released from prison, what does he do now?
After Cardinal Pell was released from prison, he went to Sydney. He was followed all the way by the media from Melbourne to Sydney, which was a drive of several hundred miles. He lived in a house near the seminary in Sydney. He went back to writing. He wrote a marvellous piece for The Australian about Easter. After a while, he went back to Rome. He was given a very warm welcome in Rome by Pope Francis, who rolled out a honour guard of Swiss guards. He went back to his house to his apartment in Rome. He didn't go back to the Secretariat for the Economy, though he took a keen interest in Vatican finances and in Vatican matters in general and church matters in general. And he wrote a couple of very controversial pieces in what probably passed for retirement, though he was always very busy. There was the infamous Demos Memo. Certainly he was one of the main authors of that, if not the main author. And he also wrote a piece for The Spectator in London questioning the value of the synod on synodality, which he really thought was quite a pointless talk fest, and he didn't bother hiding his concerns. Nor did he hide his concerns about some of the opposition in the Vatican to the AUKUS Pact. That's the defence pact between Australia, the US, and Britain, which is really there to counteract the growing influence of China in the Pacific Ocean, because the view in the Vatican was that that pact could encourage a warmongering mentality. Cardinal Pell pointed out that both sides of Australian politics, as indeed both sides of US politics, regard this as absolutely necessary. And when the occasion arose like that, he never hesitated to speak out.
After the Demos letter was the main Demos letter was sort of unveiled and made the press, a lot of people were aware that it was probably drafted by Cardinal Pell, or I think later they became aware. And he came under a lot of criticism for that, at least in certain circles of the church. Do you think that criticism was unfair?
I think the content of the letter was very sound. It was very cogently argued. It certainly wasn't his style to put out a major critical document without putting his name to it. It was written to be circulated from within the College of Cardinals. I think the name of the game of him and the others who were involved was to get their fellow cardinals thinking about the issues that need to be discussed ahead of the next conclave. It was unusual for him to do something that was anonymous. It was very unusual, but I think the points needed to be made.
So he was Cardinal Pell, I think it's clear he was a courageous man. He was a strong man. Do you think he was
courageous? Yes.
Do you think he was a humble man?
In some ways, yes. I think he would be amazed to see, through the years when there was conclave coming up, people might speculate on having an Australian Pope, and he would say, a bit of form on a country racetrack doesn't mean you're a starter for the Melbourne Cup. He would say things like that. He would be amazed at the number of people who make pilgrimages now to his tomb in the crypt of St Mary's Cathedral, I think.
What was Cardinal Pell like as a man, just talking to him?
Easy to talk to, quite funny, good sense of humour, liked a good time. He liked a nice night out at friends' places or having dinner. He was very down to earth. He was interested in a lot of subjects. He was interested in art, in music, in history, in politics. He loved to read newspapers. When he was in jail, he had to save up to buy the Australian newspaper once a week. That was one of the things he missed most. He was just an all-round character.
What did he do for Pope Francis?
The main service he performed for Pope Francis was making a very substantial start in cleaning up the mess that was the corrupt and inept mess that was the Vatican finances. He did make headway there. He closed a lot of bank accounts. It needed a strong leader. He closed a lot of Vatican bank accounts that the owners were not really entitled to hold. They had no connections with the church. He made sure that the Vatican was getting rent on the properties it owned around Rome, because for years it hadn't. He tried to centralise the Vatican's finances to get a picture of what it owned, which was very hard. I think he found there was about 1.2 billion euros in different departments that needed to be centralised, and he brought in proper auditing. He brought in standards of accountability that the Vatican hadn't seen for many a year, if not many a decade, or even many a century.
Pope Benedict, how would you describe Cardinal Pell's relationship with Pope Benedict?
I would describe it as very good, Mark. His Cardinal Pell's relationship with Pope Benedict went back a long way to the time when Pope Benedict was Cardinal Ratzinger, the prefect for the doctrine of the faith, and Cardinal Pell was one of his advisors on a casual basis. He would make trips over from Australia. Cardinal Pell had very high regard for Pope Benedict's liturgical and theological writings. He saw him as one of the great scholars of the age. He was quite indignant when Pope Benedict resigned the papacy. As I say in the book, he said to a couple of priest friends, "We elected him for life. What's he done?" He was very annoyed about it. He wrote Pope Benedict's obituary for the Australian about 4 years before Pope Benedict died. I never had the heart to tell Cardinal Pell I was assigned to write his obituary at the same time. Anyway, he finished Benedict's obituary, and when Pope Emeritus Benedict died, it ran across 2 broadsheet pages. No one imagined that Cardinal Pell's own obituary would be running across 2 broadsheet pages in a very similar style just a week later. The last conversation I had with Cardinal Pell was after Pope Benedict's funeral, and he was quite indignant about the conduct of that funeral in Rome. He was upset that the shops were open near the Vatican. He was upset that the Roman canon wasn't said, but instead the third Eucharistic prayer was said, and he was very annoyed that a lot of priests who came from overseas were not allowed to celebrate the Mass for Pope Benedict. And it was quite a remarkable couple of days. Cardinal Pell hosted a reception at his apartment in the Vatican for Cardinal Zen from Hong Kong, which was remarkable. He isn't allowed out very often from Hong Kong now. It's under the Chinese jackboot, but Cardinal Pell had a reception for him there. So Cardinal Pell said he felt remarkably sad when Pope Benedict died, even though he knew it was coming.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about John Paul II and Cardinal Pell.
Cardinal John Paul II was one of Cardinal Pell's great heroes. Shortly after John Paul II's death, Cardinal Pell was one of the first to start referring to him as John Paul the Great. Cardinal Pell was particularly happy in 2003 to be made a cardinal by John Paul II. He had immense respect for him. He fell in behind his ideas on seminary reform. He was an enthusiastic proponent of World Youth Days that were initiated by John Paul II, and he was a strong proponent of the John Paul II Institutes for Marriage and Family. It's fair to say he was one of Cardinal Pell's great papal heroes.
Tell us something you think many people would be surprised to learn about Cardinal Pell.
What I think they'd be surprised to learn about him. How kind he was. How kind he was to the battlers, to the street people. He made friends with a few people, with a few old chaps who lived on the street in Rome, and he'd say, "I just give them a few bob. It's the least I can do." It was mentioned at his funeral in Sydney about his relationship with the homeless in Sydney. We saw that very passionate commitment to justice when he was running Caritas. And again, when he was fixing up the Vatican finances, he wanted to make sure that the money that the faithful give to the poor goes to poor. And he was concerned that far too much was being wasted on administration. He saw the church as a field hospital. He was always on the side of the underdog.
What would you want people to take away from reading this book?
Cardinal Pell's commitment to faith, to truth, to justice, and to saving souls. I'd like readers to take away a sense of how much the faith can help them and their family in this life, and to think about issues relevant to what Cardinal Pell and practicing Catholics regard as the next life.